As already mentioned, we're starting a new cycle of the Narrative Lectionary. If you're new here or if you tune out every time we start talking about the Narrative Lectionary, let me explain how it works again. And so the Narrative Lectionary is sort of a bit like a guide for us as we move through the Christian year. It gives us Bible readings that we can look at each Sunday. And did that not work for me already? Oh no, there it went. So it goes in three spots. So the first part, from about now until Advent, we look for about 12 weeks at stories from the Old Testament. Then we go from Advent to Easter, we explore a gospel, and in this cycle it is the Gospel of John we will be looking at, which I'm really looking forward to. And then from Easter, have I just got the wrong one? That would make sense. And from Easter to around May, June, we spend about 10 weeks looking at the New Testament. Then we have a little bit where we can do our own thing. But today is the first of the cycle. So we are starting back in the Old Testament, and we're going to be looking at three major themes over these 12 weeks. One is looking at Jehovah-Jireh, which is the Hebrew term for our God provides. One looking at what it means to be called by God, and particularly stories from Samuel and Kings, those four books. And then we'll be looking at the promises of hope in the lead up to Advent, and they will be coming out of the prophets. All right. Just before we jump into Genesis 1, considering we're going to spend the next 3 months looking at the Old Testament, I thought it might be just helpful before we start that journey to spend just a minute or two pondering what is actually a good way to approach the Old Testament. Because I need to acknowledge that for some people, the Old Testament comes with complexities, doesn't it? The Old Testament is full of great stories, extraordinary acts of God, and gems of wisdom. But it also contains some uncomfortable passages, way too much violence, and there is some stuff there that doesn't easily align with what we would understand to be the ways of Jesus. And so how do we hold these things together? These amazing stories and wisdom and this uncomfortable stuff. I want to suggest some helpful hints of how we might be able to approach the Old Testament, considering we're going to be doing that for the next 3 months. So firstly, it might be helpful to see the Old Testament as a narrative arc where not everything is completely worked out at the beginning. The Bible tells a story of how God reveals more and more of God's self and the ways of God. God doesn't give us all at the beginning and say, well, now you know everything, I don't have to say anything more. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any need for people like the prophets or the people who wrote down Scripture. That's part of the revelation of God. People learn and grow through this revelation of experiences, as I said, the prophets and the insight that comes through reflection. And we see that in the Bible, this ongoing revelation, and it causes a movement in our understanding. For example, Genesis has examples of people taking many wives at the same time. By the time we're about halfway through the Old Testament, they've sort of worked out that faithfulness is probably best expressed when you only have one partner in a marriage. Is that making sense? There's been a movement of understanding as God reveals more of the ways of God. We might also say, the retribution of the Old Testament, eye for an eye, got refined a bit more in the times of Jesus, when Jesus is saying, forgiveness and grace is also very good as well. So we understand that, but at the same time, we also need to hold that there are some things that don't change. Things like God's faithfulness, covenant love, justice, mercy, God's desire to be with humanity. Those things don't change. So somehow we have to hold together the ongoing revelation of God and the things that don't change about God, and have the discernment to work out which is which. And lastly, I would like to encourage us as we move through the Old Testament to be open to God revealing things through other voices. Followers of God have always wrestled with sacred stories, working out what they mean in their particular time and place. And I believe there are lots to be learned by listening to the voices of other cultures, other traditions, and other life experiences, and how they understand the Old Testament, not just how we have understood the Old Testament. So, for example, what might a feminist theologian think of Genesis chapter 1? It's a good question, isn't it? What might the persecuted church hear when they're reading the story of the Exodus? Can you see what I'm saying? There are different perspectives on the Old Testament, and if we're open to hearing some of those different voices, I think we will get more out of these 3 months. God wants to speak to us through this amazing part of the Bible. So here's my challenge. Let's not skim over the dozen or so passages that we'll read on a Sunday morning over the next 3 months, but let's actually take the challenge to read the Old Testament. And to start with, I'm going to challenge us. Well, I'm going to say that I'm going to try and read Genesis over the next 4 weeks. We're looking at some stories over the Genesis over the next 4 weeks. I'm going to try and read the whole book. It works out to be about 2 chapters or so, maybe a bit less, per day. That's workable. I got in my notes, I've got a list up the back there with all the details of what we need to do. I read those notes and went, actually, they're still on my computer. They will be there by the end of the service. I will have a guide. I've also got for every day 3 interesting insights from different people. Don't think I've done a whole lot of work. This is where AI can be really helpful for you when you're asking, what are 3 different insights on this passage? And it's finding different voices to contribute back. So I've got 3 different insights and a prayer for every day. And for the next 9 days, I've already printed them out. They'll be ready for you at the back. We'll also post them online. Anyone in with me? Who's going to take the challenge with me to try and read Genesis over the next month? Look at the energy in the room. It is very different reading 4 passages over the next 4 Sundays, and we will hit the highlights of the best stories out of Genesis. It's very different reading the whole lot. You will get a very different perspective of the complexities that comes with Genesis if you read the whole lot. All right, back to the reading for today. Let's jump into Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1, if we look at it in its context, is not a standalone creation story, but rather one that was in a bigger conversation with ancient civilizations. There were many groups of people around the Middle East, many cultures who had creation stories. The Hebrew people were just one of the people who had a creation stories. But it's different to the others, and I think it's interesting to look at why is it different, or how is it different. You see, most other stories begin with a fight. The gods battle each other, they kill different monsters, they carve out this new created world out of the bodies or the corpses of their enemies. Yeah, that's the creation stories from other cultures. But you get to the creation story that we have in the Hebrew sacred writing, and it's different, isn't it? There's no battle involved. There's no enemies, but rather it's just... I've lost my place here. Instead of violence, there's this rhythm, there's this poem that's happening of how God created. God's not angry. God just speaks. And then God creates these things not through violence or destroying other people, but bringing it together to be a blessing for those who will inhabit it. It's also probably worth noting that in Genesis 1 is not a science textbook trying to explain to us how the world was created, but rather it highlights a few different things. It highlights who made the world, why they made the world, and what that says about our place in it all. It's more trying to understand if God created this, where do we fit into this? Rather than being an explanation of how was the world created? And right from the start, there's an emphasis on God's provision. Creation as a gift, not by an accident, but by a blessing, not a byproduct. Which brings us, in a long roundabout way, to our theme, which is this idea that our God provides. If you read the Old Testament with this theme in mind, you will see that this is a major theme in the Old Testament. Our God provides. Actually, we've got the classic reading coming up soon of Abraham and Isaac, and our God provides. But you will see that God provides in Genesis food, shelter, purpose, relationship. In Exodus, God provides manna and quail in the wilderness, water from a rock and laws to guide them. In the Psalms, God is described as a shepherd who leads us to green pastures and still waters. Through the prophets, God promises restoration, healing, and a future hope. In all these examples, provision is connected to relationship. The God who provides is the God who is with us. It's the story of the Old Testament. And Genesis 1 is like not only the beginning of that story, it's almost like a foundation stone of that understanding that our God provides. Before there's a covenant, before there's a wilderness journey, before there's even a human being, God is already providing, creating a good and ordered world, abundant and beautiful, ready to be inhabited. That happens all before we were even here. God is already preparing that provision. And for about the next 5 minutes, I'm just going to step through Genesis chapter 1. Long reading, thanks Barb. But I'm going to step through it, but not trying to explain it in its complexities, but rather from this lens of our God provides and see what God might say to us. So we start in the beginning. In the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth, and we are presented with this scene of chaos. The earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. If you read it in Hebrews, it also gives this image of this, inhabitable wasteland, not a place that people or anything can survive. In the ancient world, that term chaotic waters is a term that they would use for danger or instability or being a threat to life. That place is like chaotic waters. But then we find that God's first acts of provision is to bring order to the chaos. To bring order to the chaos. Light is separated from darkness, waters from waters, sea from lands. Boundaries are set so life can flourish. The danger is held back and space is made so life can flourish. It's a wonderful, caring picture of provision, isn't it? Of how sometimes God removes chaos so that we can find life. Or sometimes the chaos still might be there, but God creates a space within the chaos for us to find some shelter in the middle of it. A boundary, a pattern that keeps us from being overwhelmed. Just like God gave creation a structure, a pattern, God gives our lives structure and pattern too. We also have days and nights and seasons and Sabbath and work and rest. And if you think about it, our lives depend upon these boundaries and these patterns for our survival. If the seasons were random rather than in a pattern, we wouldn't know what to do. If day and night could happen at any time, or the tides or the temperatures swung wildly, our society would unravel. The order gives us stability in our lives. It's a gift. This pattern, this rhythm is a gift of God. And we can see that personally in our lives too. When our lives become chaotic, these rhythms or patterns can help us to find stability in our own lives. God invites us to build life-giving rhythms into our days. Things like prayer and rest and work and community and connection. If we're building those patterns into our lives, we will find our lives will make us, we'll find we'll be more connected and more stable in our lives. I also personally love how Genesis talks not just of God providing what we need, but God being extremely generous about how God gives us blessings. It tells the language that we heard in our Bible reading, the seas are teeming with living creatures, the skies are filled with birds, the earth is producing plants of all kinds. Can you see? They're very extreme words. It's overabundance that God is offering us. Abundance is part of God's character. Scarcity was never part of God's original design. God planned the world to have enough beauty, enough food, enough life forever. God also built into creation the ability to reproduce and to renew, allowing that generosity and abundance to continue. Of course, that abundance comes with responsibility, and we are called to be stewards, not exploiters. And sometimes we can see that if we think the world is not being as abundant as it used to be, it's probably because we've not been good stewards of the way that God intended it to be. When we live generously, we live in the way that God intended the world to be. I want to go out on a slight tangent just for a moment and talk about the word good. We heard it when Barb read it out. It's used 7 times in this passage, this idea of good. 6 times God looks at what God has made and calls it good, and on the 7th time God says it's very good. In the sermon blurb in the weekly emails, I pondered whether or not this word good was a value judgment on the quality of creation. You know, gee, that tree produced an apple that is pleasant to look at, okay texture and taste to eat. It's good. Is that what that word means when God looks at creation and says it's good? Is it a reflection of quality? Or is it a reflection on moral perfection in terms of good and evil? You know, that God looked at creation and said, creation is good. That God has inbuilt into creation the goodness of God. It is a good thing. It's not evil, this stuff. It's good because it reflects God. Or does good refer to how things, they're good because it's how God intended them to be? So God looked at, the animals and said, that's good. That's what I hoped it would be. That's what I wanted it to be. It is good. It is good. Or is it all of the above? It's also interesting to note what's not called good. Yes, God calls lots of things good in the passage, but did you notice that God sometimes didn't call some things good? Look at that first verse on the screen there, verse 4. God saw that the light was good, then he separated the light from the darkness. God did not call the darkness good. God called the light good, not the darkness good. There's also a day that God does not call anything good. If you're a person like me who thought, but isn't it at the end of every day it says, and God looked at it and saw it was good? Pull out your phones, have a look. There is a day that there is no mention of good at all. Nobody's pulling out their phones. That's all right. It's actually day 2 when God is separating the waters above and the waters below. There is no, and God looked at that and said, it is good. And there's some interesting commentary on why that is. It's at the end of every other day. Actually, day 3 gets 2 of them. Day 2 doesn't get any of them. One of the ideas is God doesn't like separation, when things are pulled apart, and so therefore the separations of the waters, whilst it was necessary, God didn't think it was good. And it wasn't until in day 3 when the waters are brought back together into the oceans and the lands brought together that God says that's good, because these things are coming together, not being separated. That's an interesting idea. The Hebrew way of understanding that is that actually the process of that starts at the beginning of day 2, doesn't finish till halfway through day 3. So God couldn't actually say it was good until that process was finished, and that's why day 3 gets 2 of them. I don't know. I find all this stuff interesting. Let's keep moving on. When humanity... just wait. Back to the good stuff. However we understand good to be, it's an interesting idea that if God sees creation as good, then what is our place in making sure that creation stays good? The whole, if you read some environmentalists' understanding of Genesis 1, it's about what is our role in fulfilling God's way of saying, if this is good, how do we help make creation remain good? What is our role in that? When humanity appears in the story, God blesses us with an extraordinary identity that we are made in the image of God. Here we go. That we are made in the image of God. And then in the ultimate act of provision, God places us into this world and tells us to enjoy and be blessed by it. So we are given creation as a provision to enjoy and to be blessed by us. But as I said before, provision comes with a purpose, and our purpose is to be stewards of creation, not to dominate or exploit, but to care as God would. Sustaining our creation, nurturing the creation, protecting the creation so the creation can keep multiplying, renewing and sustaining and providing for us always. The problem is that we haven't done a great job of that. If the creation can't provide like it used to, then our call is to care for creation so that it can. Good stewardship is part of how God can be a God who provides. And then lastly, we move into Genesis chapter 2 for the first 4 verses, where creation ends with not another act of making, but an act of stopping. And God rests on the 7th day, blesses it, and makes it holy. Rest is not an afterthought in creation, but rather it's part of its gift. It's a provision for our well-being, guarding us against the belief that we must keep working to survive. Sabbath rest says you are not holding the world together, God is. In a culture that prizes busyness and productivity, receiving rest as a gift takes faith. To stop is to trust that God's provision will continue even when we are not striving. I had to read out that paragraph because that was a hard paragraph for me to write. A very hard paragraph for me to write, especially after this week where there's been a lot of busyness and a lot of striving. I understand that we need to rest, but it's hard to rest when there's so much to do. But the challenge of that last paragraph when I was writing it was I was being challenged that is my busyness a sign of my lack of trust in God's provision? Let me just read that last sentence of the last paragraph again. To stop is to trust that God's provision will continue even when we are not striving or stop striving. May God help us live that out in practice. I know I've been preaching for a while, but I've got one last point. Last point to wrap this up. Humanity was created last. And why was that? The Bible gives this impression that we are sort of near the top of the created realm. We're made in the image of God. And yet, we are created surprisingly late in this story. Like, towards the end of day 6, just before rest day, we get created. If we're supposed to be the very good part of creation, then why did God wait to the very last minute to create us? Surely we should have been created before the wombat. How does this work? I think that one way we can understand this is that it affirms the idea of Jehovah Jireh, that our God provides. You see, by the time that people arrive in creation, everything is ready. The light is shining, the land is fertile, the plants are growing, the animals are there. God's provision went before us. We didn't need to work hard at making things ready. It was already done. God had already taken care of everything. And I wonder whether we can apply this truth to our own lives. Often by the time that we recognise a need in our lives, God already knows. And I believe that God's probably already working on provision within that. Jesus, during his Sermon on the Mount, addresses this issue directly. He refers to the birds and the flowers in the fields, and he says, why are you worrying? God looks after the birds. God clothes the flowers. Don't you think that God would do that for you too? Actually, Jesus says, stop worrying about what you shall eat and what you shall wear. Don't get preoccupied about getting, but instead lean into God's promise of provision. God knows what you need, and God has created a way to provide for you. Instead, Jesus says, seek first the kingdom and live righteously, and you will see that our God provides. So what does Genesis reveal to us today? A God who provides stability out of chaos. A God who sets a pattern for flourishing. A generous, abundant God. A God who gives us identity and purpose. A God who provides rest. May we all live with open hands and grateful hearts and trust that the one who began this good work in creation is still providing for us today. Amen.